My nails dug into my palms as I stood there, staring at two enormous suitcases blocking the entrance to my home. I felt the rage rising through my entire body. Sandra's heavy perfume lingered in the air, that same unbearable scent that had already given me migraines for 3 Sundays in a row. On the elegant bench I had carefully chosen for the entryway, a coat I didn't even recognize had already been tossed carelessly. And as if that weren't enough, Glenn's booming voice echoed from my living room as he blasted sports on full volume, so loud the picture frames on the wall actually vibrated. It was my house, my space, my peace. And in just a few hours, it already felt like it no longer belonged to me. "Hope you don't mind," Sandra said as she appeared in my kitchen wearing my apron as if she owned the place. Her fake smile never reached her eyes. "We thought we'd stay a few days. Glenn's back has been acting up again, and honestly, it's just easier than going back and forth." I froze in the doorway, still clutching my keys tightly in one hand while grocery bags hung heavily from my arm, growing heavier by the second. But it wasn't the bags that were truly crushing me. It was that awful feeling that something precious was being stolen from me. This hadn't happened all at once. It was more like a tide that had been slowly rising for months, and had finally reached my neck. "A few days," I managed to say, though my voice sounded sharper than usual, almost unrecognizable. "Just until Wednesday," Sandra replied with a dismissive wave of her hand, as if she were doing me a favor. Then she said the sentence that finally shattered what little patience I had left. "Nolan said it was perfectly fine." My stomach dropped. My own husband had decided to invite his parents to stay in our home, without even asking me. Not a phone call, not a text, not even the bare minimum of respect. In that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't a visit. It was an invasion. My name is Olivia, I'm 34 years old, and I work as a UX designer. And this is the story of how I reclaimed my sanctuary, after it was slowly stolen from me piece by piece. For 3 long years, I lived cramped inside a tiny apartment, where my foldable desk was shoved into the corner of our bedroom. That was where I spent endless hours racing against deadlines, answering emails, designing projects, while also trying to keep the home in order, cook, clean, and survive the daily chaos. I had no room to breathe, no privacy, no place that truly felt like mine. That's why this house meant everything to me. It wasn't just a new home. It was my reward, my peace, my sanctuary. Every corner represented years of hard work, sacrifice, and postponed dreams. It had a beautiful breakfast nook flooded with sunlight every morning, where I imagined sipping coffee in silence. It had my own private office, a space designed especially for me, where I could finally work without interruptions. There was even a small extra room I had set aside to become my yoga studio. A place to heal, breathe, and reconnect with myself. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building the life I had always wanted. Nolan was proud too when we moved in. And he should have been. After all, his own construction company had built the house. He supervised every detail obsessively, as if he were creating a masterpiece. Every wall, every finish, every decision carried his signature. It was our achievement, our future, a home. The first time his parents came to visit, it was tolerable. Awkward, yes, but manageable. His father made a few dry comments about our choices. Too flashy, they said about our quartz countertops, as if our taste was somehow excessive. His mother, Sandra, criticized my lighting choices in that passive-aggressive tone she had perfected, as though she were the professional designer and I were just improvising. I would have chosen something more elegant. That feels a little cold, don't you think? Well, if you like it. But I took a deep breath and let it go. I told myself they were just being the typical critical in-laws. I convinced myself their visits would only be occasional. They'd come by, observe, make a few uncomfortable comments, and then return to their own home. That I could handle. Or at least that's what I thought. Because then, the visits started multiplying. First it was once a month. Then every other week. And before I even realized it, it was every Sunday. Every single one. "Oh, we just happened to be in the area. It's easier if we eat here. We didn't want to bother you, we were just stopping by to say hello." But it was never just a quick visit. They stayed for hours. They used my kitchen. They invaded my living room. They criticized my decisions. They moved my things. And little by little, my sanctuary began to feel less like mine. Every Sunday, I lost another piece of my peace. What I had worked so hard to build slowly became an extension of other people's expectations, opinions, and demands. And worst of all, Nolan never seemed to see it as a problem. To him, it was family. Me. It was the beginning of a silent invasion. They claimed it was easier for everyone this way. Less cleaning for us. More practical to eat here. But the truth was something else entirely. They never asked. They never requested permission. They simply arrived as though this house belonged to them too, took control of everything, and expected to be served. As if I were the permanent hostess of a family hotel I had never agreed to own. Glenn took over the living room the moment he walked through the door. He turned on the television so loudly it felt more like a stadium than a home. Sports commentators shouted as if they were physically inside my house, their voices rattling the walls and destroying any possibility of peace. My home, the place I had dreamed of as my sanctuary, was transformed into a sports bar every single Sunday. Meanwhile, Sandra invaded my kitchen. She didn't help. She didn't cook. She simply supervised and criticized. She stood behind me, watching my every move as though she were evaluating my domestic abilities. "Don't you use garlic powder?" she asked me once, genuinely shocked, as if I had just admitted I didn't know how to wash my hands. I let out one of those polite laughs people give to avoid conflict and explained that I preferred fresh garlic because the flavor was better. But Sandra simply tilted her head, studying me as though my choice were odd, even suspicious. As if cooking differently from her was practically an act of rebellion. Every ingredient I chose became a subject for judgment. "You buy that. I would do it differently." Well, to each their own. And Nolan, my husband, he just smiled. He kissed his mother on the cheek, told her how nice she looked, and carried on as though everything were perfectly normal. He never acknowledged that while they were visiting, I was cooking for 5 people instead of 2. He never mentioned that I was the one cleaning up afterward. He never considered the physical and emotional exhaustion of hosting them every week while also preparing for Monday meetings, deadlines, clients, and work responsibilities. Carried everything. Meals, cleaning, politeness, patience, and still, I felt invisible. What hurt the most was watching how, little by little, my home was beginning to change to accommodate them. The guest room. That space, the room I had imagined as my future yoga studio, my peaceful retreat, my place to reconnect with myself, slowly stopped feeling like mine. After the 3rd Sunday they decided to take a little nap. Sandra made things perfectly clear. "Glenn's back really suffers on the couch." She said it so casually, as though she were simply solving an obvious problem. "The guest bed is much better for his posture." And just like that, without asking permission, without consideration, without any real conversation, they claimed that space too. My future yoga studio slowly became their Sunday resting station. Their pillows, their blankets, their routines. My dream replaced by their needs. I felt frustration burning inside me, but I swallowed it down. Because what was I supposed to say? "Stop visiting your son. Please get out of my house." Sounded selfish. Petty. They made me feel as though protecting my own boundaries was somehow cruel. So I kept smiling. Kept giving in. I kept allowing small invasions disguised as family gatherings. But inside me, something was growing. It wasn't just irritation. It wasn't simple exhaustion. It was something deeper. A dangerous mixture of resentment, sadness, and suppressed rage. Because every Sunday I wasn't just losing time. I was losing space, losing comfort, losing control, losing pieces of myself inside my own home. And even though I didn't fully realize it yet, That feeling kept growing in my chest. Heavier, darker, more impossible to ignore. A silent resentment began taking root inside me. It wasn't loud, didn't explode, but it was there, tightening around my chest more and more each time. A constant, quiet tension that slowly began stealing my peace. It got to the point where every time I heard tires pulling into the driveway, my body tensed automatically. My heart sank, and instead of feeling happy in my own home, I felt anxious. Because I knew exactly what was coming. The criticism, the noise, the invasion, the emotional and physical burden of yet another unannounced visit. My home was no longer a place of rest. It was a place of anticipation. One night, after they finally left, I gathered the courage to speak up. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to sound aggressive. I just wanted to be heard. So I carefully approached Nolan while he sat there scrolling through his phone as usual, completely relaxed after another Sunday where I had done everything. In a gentle voice I said, "Maybe next weekend we could have a quiet one. Just us." He looked up, genuinely confused. "What do you mean, quiet?" I took a deep breath. "Well, we've had a lot of visits lately. I'd really love one Sunday without commentary on how I cook." I tried to say it lightly, almost jokingly, hoping he'd understand the hint without feeling attacked. But Nolan let out a small laugh. "They mean well, Liv. You know how they are. You're overthinking it." Overthinking it. It was always that. Always. I wasn't exhausted. I wasn't uncomfortable. I wasn't being displaced in my own home. I was simply overthinking. I was the dramatic one, the sensitive one, the one who analyzed everything too much. Because that had been my role for years. The understanding one, the considerate one, the one who adjusts, the one who makes room for everyone. Even when no one does the same for her. So I decided to try something different. If direct communication didn't work, maybe showing him the double standard would. The following week we were making dinner together. I was chopping peppers in the kitchen while he busied himself nearby, distracted as always. In the most casual tone possible I said, "Hey, I was thinking maybe my parents could come stay over for a night next month. Just one weekend. They still haven't seen the house." Nolan's reaction was immediate. He froze. "Your parents? Staying here?" As if I had suggested turning our home into an airport terminal. "Yes," I replied calmly. "Just one night. We could cook together, spend time as a family. Something simple." But the look on his face was almost horrified, as though my suggestion were some kind of threat. "Liv, no offense, but your dad makes me feel like I'm in a job interview." I blinked. "Excuse me." "Yeah, and your mom." He paused, carefully searching for the right words. "I'd have to be, you know, on. Yeah, like really proper. Watching what I say. Making conversation. Being on my best behavior the whole time." I just stared at him in silence. Because suddenly, without even realizing it, he had just perfectly described exactly how I felt every single time his parents invaded our home. The double standard was staggering. When it came to my family, one single night was exhausting, uncomfortable, too much effort. But when it came to his family, I was expected to tolerate it every week with a smile, without complaint, without overthinking. In that moment something inside me clicked. It wasn't that Nolan didn't understand boundaries. He understood them perfectly well. It was simply that mine didn't matter as much. His parents' needs always came first. My comfort was negotiable. My peace was secondary. And for the first time I began to see our dynamic with painful clarity. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't exaggerating. I wasn't being difficult. I was being ignored. And that truth hurt more than I expected. I let the knife hit the cutting board harder than necessary. The sharp crack echoed through the kitchen. It wasn't an accident. It was pure frustration. I looked him dead in the eyes, trying to process what I had just heard. "So for you, being on basically just means acting like a decent person?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. Nolan looked up, clearly irritated. "Don't twist my words," he shot back immediately, growing defensive. He let out a heavy sigh, as though I were the one making something simple unnecessarily difficult. "I'm just saying I can't really relax around your parents. They're not as easygoing as mine." And there it was, that exact moment, like the final piece snapping into place in a painful puzzle. I finally understood something I had been trying to ignore for far too long. My comfort ranked second in his mind. Maybe not even second. Maybe it didn't rank at all. I took a deep breath. Every word I said after that was carefully measured, because I knew that if I unleashed everything I truly felt, I would explode. "Do you realize," I said slowly, "that I've been hosting your parents every single week for months?" He didn't answer, so I continued. "I cook for them. I clean up after them. I serve them. I listen to your mother criticize how I fold towels, how I organize my kitchen, how I run my home." My voice began to tremble, not from weakness, but from everything I had been holding in. "And yet, you really think the person making the bigger effort here is you because of one single night with my parents?" Silence. Nolan didn't even have the courage to truly respond. He just shrugged, as though everything I had said was exaggerated, as though my feelings were some minor inconvenience. Then he simply turned back to stirring the pot on the stove. As if our conversation didn't matter. As if I didn't matter. That gesture broke something inside me. 'Cause it wasn't just indifference. It was confirmation. Confirmation that my boundaries, my exhaustion, and my peace were all expendable. As long as he never had to feel uncomfortable. The days passed, but that conversation continued weighing heavily on my chest. And then came the moment that changed everything. I came home after running errands. I expected peace, maybe silence. But the second I opened the front door, I saw them. 2 enormous suitcases in the hallway. Again, blocking the entrance like a declaration of occupation. My breathing stopped for a moment. An icy emptiness ran through my body. They weren't just suitcases. They were a warning. A crystal-clear sign that my wishes, my boundaries, and my authority in my own home had been completely ignored. I found Nolan in the kitchen, perfectly calm, as though nothing was unusual. As though this were completely normal. "They're only staying a couple of days," he said without even looking up from his phone. No apology. No prior conversation. Not a shred of consideration. "You know how they are." That phrase. The same excuse as always. "Besides, it's not a big deal." Not a big deal. I felt my heart slam hard against my chest. Not from sadness. From rage. Because to him, it was never a big deal when the sacrifice was mine. My space. My routine. My peace. All minimized with one empty phrase. It's not a big deal. But it was. It was everything. Because this wasn't about a few days. It was about a complete lack of respect. About decisions being made without me. About a constant invasion disguised as family. I walked upstairs, my heart pounding harder with every step. Each one felt heavier than the last. I headed toward the guest room. Or rather, the space that had once been my dream yoga studio. And as I walked, I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't resignation. It was something else. Something firmer. Colder. More final. 'Cause for the first time, I stopped asking myself how to endure this, and started asking myself how to end it. When I opened the guest room door, something inside me shattered completely. The bed was already unmade. Not used. Not borrowed. Made. As though they had been settled in for days. As though the space already belonged to them. Sandra's silk robe hung confidently over the chair as if she were staying in her own vacation home. Glenn's slippers were neatly placed by the door. It didn't even look temporary. It looked permanent. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at what had once meant so much to me. That room wasn't just another room. It was my symbol of future peace. My personal retreat. The place where I had carefully hung eucalyptus bundles, imagining quiet mornings, Deep breaths, yoga, meditation, silence. It was the space where I dreamed of reconnecting with myself after years of chaos. I inhaled sharply in disbelief. The fresh, calming scent was gone. In its place was the smell of menthol cream, cheap lotion, and Glenn's overpowering aftershave. My sanctuary had been replaced by their comfort. My dreams displaced by their routines. And worst of all, no one seemed to think there was anything wrong with that. That night at dinner, Sandra behaved exactly as always. Comfortable, relaxed, fully settled in. As though I were merely the household staff. "Olivia," she said in that sweet but demanding voice, "would you mind changing the laundry detergent?" I slowly looked up. "The lavender one you use irritates Glenn's skin." And Glenn, never one to miss an opportunity, added. "And the water pressure in the upstairs shower is a little too strong. Think you can get that adjusted?" I stayed silent for a few seconds. It was so absurd, it was almost laughable. They hadn't just invaded my home. Now they wanted to customize it to fit their needs. My detergent, my shower, my home. Everything had to be adjusted for them. I gave a thin smile. So thin it was practically a warning. "Of course," I replied. "I'll add it to my list." But inside, I was burning. I looked over at Nolan across the table. My husband, my supposed partner, the man who was meant to support me. And there he was, eating peacefully as though nothing had changed. As though his wife wasn't being displaced in her own home. As though this entire situation were perfectly normal. Not one word. Not one objection. Not one defense. Nothing. That night I lay in bed, but sleep was impossible. I stared at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above me. I heard their footsteps in the hallway. Doors opening and closing. Pipes running. Voices drifting through the house. Every sound was a reminder that I no longer had privacy. No longer had peace. My mind refused to quiet down. All the words I hadn't said buzzed in my head like a trapped storm. My entire body ached. Not from physical exhaustion, but from the brutal effort of suppressing every reaction, every tear, every scream I knew I wasn't supposed to express. Because for far too long, I had been taught that being a good wife meant enduring, being understanding, being flexible, being silent. Beside me, Nolan slept deeply, snoring softly, completely oblivious to the emotional war raging inside me. And sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, in that heavy silence, I finally understood something with absolute clarity. I only had 2 choices. Continue being this family's elegant doormat, or take back control of my life. Keep being the woman who smiles while she's pushed aside, or become someone who sets real boundaries. Remain trapped in a life designed for everyone else's comfort, or choose my own peace. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I wanted. I slowly turned in bed, opened my nightstand drawer, picked up my phone. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from determination. I texted one person, "Rebecca, do you still have that guest room available?" Rebecca had been my best friend for years. The one person who always reminded me who I was before I got lost trying to please everyone else. Her reply came almost instantly. "Always." I stared at the glowing screen in the darkness, and for the first time in months, felt relief. I didn't have everything figured out yet, but I had just taken the first step. And sometimes, the first step is the most powerful one of all. I still didn't have a full plan. I didn't know exactly how I was going to change my situation, or how far I was willing to go. But something inside me had already changed. It was subtle, but final. I wasn't furious. Not yet. It wasn't the kind of explosive anger that destroys everything in its path. It was something colder, sharper, more dangerous. I had simply stopped accepting being invisible. For too long I had adapted, given up space, given up comfort, given up peace, all to maintain harmony, to avoid conflict, to be reasonable. But that version of me was beginning to disappear. The next morning I got up early just like always. I made Nolan's coffee exactly the way he liked it. Extra hot. With a splash of oat milk. Perfect. I placed it on the kitchen counter without saying a word. No good morning. No smile. No conversation. Just the coffee. Automatic. Routine. He didn't even notice I hadn't made one for myself. Didn't ask. Didn't realize. That confirmed more than I wanted to admit. Sandra was already settled into my kitchen, wearing my robe, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. As though every small boundary had already been completely erased. "Olivia," she said in that falsely sweet tone that exhausted me, "do you have any chamomile tea that isn't quite so floral? My stomach feels a little unsettled." I looked at her in silence. Without saying more than necessary, I opened the cabinet and took out the box. I handed it to her and walked away. No smile. No comment. No energy left to keep pretending hospitality. A few minutes later, Glenn shuffled in, yawning dramatically as though he were in his own retirement home. He turned on the television. Volume 39. The deafening roar of sports commentators filled every corner of the house once again. And that was when I felt it with brutal clarity. Never before had I felt like a stranger in my own home. But now, that was exactly what I was. An uncomfortable visitor. Someone who had to move carefully so as not to inconvenience the people who clearly held priority there. My footsteps became quieter. My movements smaller. My needs more suppressed. I was walking through my own home as though I needed permission to exist. And that was slowly destroying me. By Tuesday night, Nolan casually dropped another bombshell as if he were commenting on the weather. "I think my parents are staying through the weekend." I slowly looked up. He kept going as though it were pure logic. "It's easier since they're already here. No point making them pack twice." As though the real inconvenience was moving their luggage. Not the fact that they had been invading my life for nearly a week. I stared at him from the bathroom sink. "They've already been here 5 days. My voice was firm, controlled, but heavy. "It's temporary," he replied, without looking at me, avoiding my eyes, as though even he knew what he was doing was unfair. Temporary. That word was beginning to feel like a lie repeated often enough to justify any abuse. Because temporary wasn't 5 days, or a week, or endless Sundays. Temporary had become an excuse to normalize my displacement. That night I needed to work. I had an important UX redesign presentation. A professional opportunity that required focus, creativity, and concentration. I went upstairs searching for refuge in my office. The space specifically designed for my career, my independence, my growth. I opened the door and felt my jaw tighten instantly. My office was no longer my office. It was filled with Sandra's craft supplies. Ribbon, paper, glue, boxes. Her personal projects were spread everywhere as though she had officially claimed the room. And in one corner, Glenn's golf clubs, his things, his hobbies, his needs, invading that space too. My desk, my professional sanctuary, had been reduced to family storage. I stood there in silence, staring at the scene. Another piece of me had just been taken. My kitchen, my yoga room, my peace, and now, my career too. That was when I realized something terrifying. If I didn't do something soon, there would be absolutely nothing left of my life that was truly mine. That night, I ended up working from the corner of my own bed, sitting cross-legged with an aching back, my laptop barely balanced on my knees. My files were scattered across the floor as though my entire career had been reduced to an improvised corner. The office I had dreamed of no longer belonged to me. Now it was overrun by Sandra's craft boxes, ridiculous decorations, glue, ribbons, and Glenn's golf clubs. So there I was, a 34-year-old professional UX designer, trying to deliver an important presentation. From the edge of my bed, as though I were living in a borrowed college dorm. Meanwhile, Sandra was comfortably seated nearby folding laundry. My bedding, her towels, The entire scene was so surreal it felt like a cruel parody of my own life. I tried to focus, reviewing designs, adjusting proposals, when suddenly the door burst open. No knock, no warning. It was Glenn. "Where's the HDMI cable?" he asked, as though I were hotel reception. I didn't even look up from my screen. "Try the drawer under the TV stand." "Oh," and he left. Just like that. No apology, no respect, just another interruption in my home. In my space. In my life. When the door finally closed again, Sandra asked with that fake concern she wore so effortlessly, "Do you always work this late?" I nodded, my jaw tight. "It's quieter at night." It wasn't a lie. Nighttime was the only moment I could still pretend I had some control. Sandra adjusted a towel, fluffing it with exaggerated precision. "You should really think more about setting boundaries." I almost stopped breathing. Work-life balance is very important. For one brief second, I nearly laughed out loud. Not a polite laugh. Not a forced smile. A real, bitter, almost hysterical laugh. Because the woman who had invaded my home, my kitchen, my office, and even my yoga room, was giving me advice about boundaries. The irony was so brutal it physically hurt. But I said nothing. I simply breathed. 'Cause something new was growing inside me. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was strategy. The next day, Nolan and his parents went out for a late brunch. Without inviting me. They didn't even pretend to be polite. They simply assumed I would stay behind. Maybe working. Maybe cleaning. Maybe existing around their needs as always. And for the first time, I was grateful for their absence. The moment they left, I grabbed my phone and called Rebecca. She answered on the second ring. "You sound like someone who's 5 seconds away from setting a decorative pillow on fire." I couldn't help letting out a small, exhausted laugh. "I'm close." "Then come to my house." I closed my eyes for a moment. I wish it were that simple. Rebecca was silent for a few seconds. I knew her well enough to recognize when she was thinking. Then her voice lowered, as though she were about to suggest something dangerous. "Well, then don't make it simple." I frowned. "What?" "Make it complicated." My attention sharpened instantly. Rebecca continued. "Be strategic, Olivia. That's always been your strength." That word. Strategic. Not emotional. Not impulsive. Not dramatic. Strategic. And how exactly am I supposed to do that? There was a brief pause. And then, Rebecca presented me with a plan. Plan so absurd. It was brilliant. "Remember that moving company your brother works for?" I felt a slow smile forming for the first time in days. "Yeah. I think we can arrange a very special delivery for your in-laws." I went silent, processing, visualizing. And then, I smiled for real. Not out of politeness. Not out of resignation. But out of hope. Control. Justice. "I'm making a call," I said. That night I put the first part of the plan into motion. I told Nolan, with carefully measured concern in my voice, that my aunt in Portland had fallen and broken her wrist. That she was alone. That she urgently needed help. And that I would need to leave for a few days. I expected concern. Questions. Maybe even genuine interest. But Nolan barely looked up from his phone. "Are you driving or flying?" That was it. "I'm driving. It's faster." I shrugged. "Drive safe." Nothing more. No sadness. No real support. No "I'll miss you." Just indifference. Sandra and Glenn, of course, had far more important concerns. "Did you leave food prepared?" Sandra asked. "Is there anything frozen we can reheat?" Glenn added. "Course. Because even my so-called family emergency only mattered in terms of how it affected their comfort. And it was right then. Watching them care more about their meals than about me. That every ounce of guilt disappeared. I wasn't abandoning my home. I was preparing to reclaim it. And this time, I would do it on my terms. "We don't want to ruin your kitchen system," Sandra said with a mocking smile and playful wink, as though her comment were charming. as though she hadn't spent weeks dismantling exactly that. My system, my routine, my peace, my entire home. But that night, I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I didn't defend anything. Because for the first time I wasn't reacting. I was executing. Packed one small suitcase. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looked like some emotional escape. No oversized luggage. No tears. No confrontation. Just the essentials. Clothes, laptop, charger. Few important documents. Everything carefully chosen, like someone who was no longer running away, but taking control. Every movement was calm, precise, silent. Because this wasn't a crisis. It was strategy. Before leaving, I stepped into our bedroom one last time. I looked around the space. The perfectly made bed. Lamps. The place where I had spent so many nights trying to convince myself things would get better. Then I placed a single envelope on my nightstand. Just one. Simple. Inside was a handwritten note. Short. Direct. No drama. No unnecessary explanations. I'll be away for a while. If you needed space. Now you have it. Olivia. I reread it once. And I felt no guilt. Not even a trace. Because guilt belongs to someone who abandons a relationship without reason. I wasn't abandoning anything. I was responding to months of invasion, indifference, and disrespect. That was different. Very different. When I walked out the door, I didn't feel sadness. Felt lighter. As though I could finally breathe deeply after holding my breath for far too long. Rebecca opened the door to her apartment holding a bottle of wine in one hand, and wearing an expression that said everything. Finally. There was no interrogation. No judgment. Just immediate understanding. Her apartment wasn't large. It didn't have soaring ceilings, a designer kitchen, or extra rooms. But it had something my house had lost a long time ago. Silence. Safety. It was warm. Cozy. And completely free of passive-aggressive criticism, deafening televisions, and invasive in-laws. I stepped inside, set my small bag beside the table, and for the first time in weeks, my shoulders relaxed. I set up my laptop on her guest table, lit a candle, watched the small flame dance softly, and exhaled. Not just any breath. A deep, soul-level exhale. The kind your body releases when it finally understands it's no longer in survival mode. For the first time in a very long time. Felt peace. Meanwhile, back at the house, my absence didn't take long to be noticed. Not because they genuinely missed me, but because my function had disappeared. The cook, the hostess, the organizer, the woman who silently held everything together. Nolan called the next morning. I watched his name light up my screen, stared at it for a few seconds, and let it ring. I wasn't ready to hear hollow excuses or fake confusion. When the phone stopped ringing, voicemail appeared. I ignored that too. Instead, I sent one brief text. Missed the last train back. Simple. Believable. No room for debate. Rebecca raised an eyebrow when she read it from across the room. The last train. I gave a slight smile as I sipped my wine. It's a start. 'Cause yes, I wasn't finished yet. In fact, I was just getting started. I'll stay one more day. That was my first message. Then another. And another after that. Each day came with a new, perfectly reasonable excuse. My aunt still needs help. Traffic is impossible. It became more complicated than expected. Everything carefully calculated. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing suspicious. Just enough to maintain distance. While my real plan moved forward. Nolan, of course, barely questioned any of it. His attention remained focused on his routine, his comfort, and keeping his parents happy. Perfect. That made everything easier. By the 5th day, the moment had arrived. That morning, exactly as planned, a massive moving truck slowly pulled into our driveway. Large. Impossible to ignore. The kind of truck that doesn't deliver simple packages, but permanent change. Sandra was the first to notice it from the living room window. "Oh," she said casually. "They must be delivering something for Olivia." She still assumed everything revolved around her normal expectations. But this time, didn't. Two uniformed movers stepped out with complete professionalism. No hesitation. No confusion. And they immediately began unloading large boxes clearly labeled with words Sandra never expected to see. Radford. Master bedroom. Sandra frowned. Her usual confidence quickly dissolved into confusion. She opened the front door immediately. "Excuse me, what exactly is this?" One of the movers, perfectly calm, handed her a clipboard. "Sunrise relocation, ma'am. We have a work order to install furnishings at this residence. The address matches." Sandra blinked, stunned. Glenn appeared behind her. "Yes, we're the Radfords." The mover smiled professionally. "Perfect." And then they continued. Without pause. Without question. Because everything had been authorized. Everything was in order. They began carrying in furniture. Not small deliveries. Not decorative packages. Actual furniture. A queen-sized bed. Dressers. A recliner. Boxes of kitchen supplies. Linens. Personal household items. Every single piece sent one devastatingly clear message. This wasn't a visit. It was a move-in. Glenn blinked repeatedly, clearly lost. "This has to be some kind of mistake." The foreman reviewed the paperwork and pointed directly to the manifest. "It clearly states, delivery for Glenn and Sandra Radford. New residence. 912 Silver Hill Lane." Silence. The color drained from Sandra's face. Her mouth opened, then closed. She had no words. 'Cause for the first time, she was experiencing what it felt like to lose control of a situation she thought she dominated. And technically, there was no mistake. Everything was exactly as it should be. While they had spent months acting like permanent residents, I had simply made that logic official. If they wanted to settle in indefinitely, then they would. For real. When Nolan came home that afternoon, the scene was glorious. The guest room had been completely transformed. It was no longer temporary. It was a fully established residence. Closets filled with his parents' clothes. Furniture arranged. Personal belongings everywhere. Everything perfectly organized for a permanent stay. And as the final touch, on the mailbox, just beneath our names, was a small new label. "And parents." Subtle. Legal. Devastating. According to Rebecca, who received detailed photo updates of every moment, Nolan's expression was absolutely priceless. Confusion. Horror. Realization. Because he finally understood something he had never wanted to hear from me. When you turn your parents into unofficial residents, someone else can decide to make it official. And this time, that someone was me. When Nolan walked through the front door that evening, everything changed. He heard movement, saw boxes, new furniture, clothing, too many belongings, too much permanence. He dropped his keys onto the table and looked around, completely stunned. What the hell is going on here? For the first time in a very long time, he was genuinely shocked. Sandra, meanwhile, looked delighted. She was smiling as though this were some wonderful family surprise. "Isn't it fantastic?" she said enthusiastically. Nolan frowned. Sandra continued, happily settling into her new reality. "Olivia said we could use this space while she's away." Glenn, settled like royalty in his new recliner, added casually, "We figured since you'd be alone for a while. This just made sense." Sandra smiled even wider. She even arranged the move. Wasn't that thoughtful? Thoughtful. The word was almost laughable. Because they were finally experiencing exactly what I had lived through. Decisions made without consultation. Changes imposed. Comfort assumed without consent. Only this time, the discomfort wasn't mine. Nolan stood frozen. Then he noticed the envelope on the nightstand. My envelope. My note. He picked it up again, even though he had already read it. As if somehow the words might magically change. as if a second reading would offer some different explanation. But it didn't. It still said exactly the same thing. I'll be away for a while. If you needed space. Now you have it. Olivia. Simple. Direct. Irrefutable. And in that moment, I think he finally began to understand. I wasn't having an emotional breakdown. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't running away. I was making a statement. A strategic one. Rebecca had been brilliant. But her brother was absolute perfection. As the owner of the moving company, he executed every detail flawlessly. Later, he told me laughing that Sandra and Glenn never truly questioned anything important. The moment they saw their names officially printed on the work order, they assumed everything had been fully authorized. 'Cause of course, they had always acted like it was their home too. They just needed paperwork to convince themselves completely. Nolan tried calling me several times. I watched every call come through, and let every single one ring. For the first time, he was the one without immediate access to me. Then came the text. Olivia, enough. We need to talk. I didn't respond right away. I let him wait. 3 hours to be exact. Then I finally replied. Can't talk. You're busy hosting. Hope everything goes well. Rebecca nearly spit out her wine when she read my message. That was beautiful, she said between laughter. And honestly, it was. Meanwhile, in Rebecca's small apartment, my life began to feel like mine again. Cooked peacefully. Without criticism about fresh garlic. Without absurd detergent requests. Without blaring television. I made dinner quietly. Sat on the couch. Watched an entire movie uninterrupted. No questions. No invasions. No forced smiles. That night I slept deeply. Until 9 a.m. Without hearing heavy footsteps in the hallway. Without doors opening without knocking. Without toilets flushing at 6 in the morning. Without feeling like a stranger in my own space. When I woke up, I stayed in bed for a few extra seconds, simply enjoying the silence. And that was when I realized something profoundly powerful. Peace isn't always lost all at once. Sometimes it disappears slowly, until you forget what it even feels like. And when you finally get it back, you realize how much of your life you were surviving, instead of living. The next morning, while Rebecca was making coffee, her neighbor passed by and casually asked, "Visitor?" Rebecca smiled. "No. Recovery." And honestly, no word had ever felt more accurate. Rebecca's neighbor, who happened to work at a local real estate office, became an unexpectedly perfect source of information. Sandra, as always, talked too much. And naturally, she needed someone to vent to. So without realizing it, she began spilling details about everything happening in her new living situation inside my house. And every update came straight to me. Message after message. Little reports. Delicious details. Real-time domestic chaos. The plan was working even better than I imagined. During the first week without me, Nolan still tried to pretend he had everything under control. His pride was intact. So was his denial. He sent me a message that read, "Everything's under control. You'll see." As if he were trying to prove that I had exaggerated everything. That he could easily handle what I had been carrying alone for months. 2 days later, I received a photo of a half-cooked lasagna, burnt cheese on top, clearly underdone. The caption read, "Chef Nolan in action." I stared at it for a few seconds. And simply smiled. Because I knew exactly what was coming next. And it didn't take long. By the second week, his tone had completely changed. "Do you know where the vacuum bags are? The washing machine smells weird. Is that normal? Where do you keep your mom's roasted chicken recipe? What detergent did you use for the towels? How do you keep your mother-in-law from complaining?" Okay, he never actually sent that last one. But it was practically implied. Every message was a tiny surrender disguised as a domestic question. I didn't respond. Not to a single one. Rebecca saw my face while I read the texts and laughed. Amazing how fast "it's not a big deal" turns into "help me, I'm drowning." And she was absolutely right. 'Cause finally, Nolan was living exactly what I had lived. The constant pressure, the endless demands, the invisible mental load, the invasion of personal space, the silent responsibility of keeping everything functioning while others simply existed inside the chaos. Sandra also started calling me every couple of days. I still had her number saved from all those endless Sunday invitations that were never really invitations. Most of the time I let it ring. But one day, answered. "Olivia, dear." Her tone was fake sweet, carefully measured. "Are you planning to return soon?" I looked at the phone for a moment before answering. "Why?" Brief pause. "Well, you know." "Oh." I knew exactly. "You have the whole house now," I replied calmly. Sandra cleared her throat. "It's just that Glenn and I were under the impression this was temporary." I couldn't help it. Smiled. "So was I." Absolute silence. Heavy. Awkward. Perfect. Finally, Sandra spoke again, this time with noticeably less confidence. "Nolan seems stressed." Course he was. "He misses you." I didn't answer. Because what I didn't say was far more powerful. Nolan didn't just miss me. He missed everything I did. The structure, the organization, the cooking, the cleaning, the emotional management, the emotional labor, the invisible systems, the peace I created. He didn't miss me as a wife. He missed me as the foundation holding his entire life together. And that realization was priceless. By the third week, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. Rebecca's neighbor continued delivering updates like clockwork. Sandra had started complaining openly. Not about me. About Nolan. "He doesn't clean properly. The dishwasher is loaded wrong. He forgot Glenn's low-sodium groceries. The guest room mattress feels smaller somehow." I nearly laughed myself breathless. 'Cause for the first time, Sandra was experiencing what happened when there was no woman silently absorbing everyone's expectations. No one was smoothing the edges. No one was anticipating needs. No one was carrying the invisible burden. And suddenly, everything felt harder. Nolan, meanwhile, sounded increasingly desperate. "Can we please talk? I didn't realize how overwhelmed you were. This has gotten out of hand." Out of hand. That phrase lingered. Because things hadn't gotten out of hand. They had simply reached his hands. And apparently, he couldn't handle what I had been expected to endure indefinitely. That distinction mattered. One evening, he finally sent the message I had been waiting for. "I told my parents they need to go home." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Not because I was emotional. Because I was evaluating. 3 weeks earlier, I would have cried with relief. But now I understood something far more important. The problem had never just been his parents. The real problem was that Nolan had allowed it. Encouraged it. Minimized my pain. Dismissed my boundaries. And only acted once the burden became his. That changed everything. So I responded carefully. "I'm glad you're finally setting boundaries." Long pause. "Are you coming home?" I looked around Rebecca's peaceful apartment. My coffee. My laptop. I come. My reclaimed sense of self. And for the first time, I answered honestly. "Not until I'm sure it's still my home too." That message changed everything. 'Cause for the first time, Nolan understood this was no longer about a temporary argument. It was about whether our marriage could survive the damage caused by his neglect. Over the next several days, his calls became less defensive, less demanding, more honest. He apologized, not performatively, not vaguely, specifically, for dismissing me, for minimizing my exhaustion, for forcing me into the role of caretaker without consent, for making me feel invisible. And while the apologies mattered, what mattered more was action. Sandra and Glenn moved out. For real this time. Not temporarily. Not after one more weekend. their belongings, their routines, their assumptions, removed. Nolan even converted the guest room back. He removed every trace of their occupation. The recliner, the craft boxes, the golf clubs, everything. When Rebecca's brother sent me photos of the restored room, I stared at them quietly. My eucalyptus bundles were back. My yoga mats returned. My sanctuary had been physically reclaimed. But emotionally, that would take longer. Because walls can be restored much faster than trust. When I finally returned home, it was silent. No blaring television. No passive-aggressive commentary. No foreign perfume lingering in my kitchen. Just stillness. Nolan stood in the hallway, looking more nervous than I had ever seen him. And for once, he didn't act entitled to forgiveness. He simply said, "I was wrong." 3 words. Simple. Long overdue. And while they didn't erase everything, they were a beginning. I walked through my house slowly, touching familiar surfaces, breathing deeply, reclaiming space, not as someone begging to be respected, but as someone who now understood exactly what she required. And that was the real victory. Because this story was never truly about revenge. It was about restoration. My peace, my boundaries, my voice, my home. And this time, they were built on something stronger than politeness. They were built on consequences. The peace he never valued because he simply assumed it would always be there. For the first time, he was truly experiencing everything I had been carrying alone for months. Constant noise, the criticism, the absurd demands, the lack of privacy, the interruptions, the physical and mental burden of maintaining a home full of people who only take. 3 days later, I finally received the message I had been waiting for most. "I'm sorry." I reread it several times. "This has been really hard. I truly didn't realize how much you were carrying on your own." For the first time, real acknowledgement. But then came the second part. The part that changed everything. Still, they're my parents. I can't just kick them out. I stared at the screen. And there it was. The full truth. He still didn't fully understand. Yes, he now recognized my effort. Yes, he now felt the pressure. Yes, he now saw the problem. But he still expected me to accept living inside that sacrifice. Because in the end, his boundaries still ranked below his parents' comfort. His solution wasn't to protect me. It was simply to better manage my suffering. That single line told me everything I needed to know. It didn't matter how much he apologized. It didn't matter how much he admitted. If he was still incapable of setting real boundaries, nothing would truly change. And it was in that moment, with a calmness I had never felt before, that I made a final decision. This was no longer just about teaching a lesson. Now it was about reclaiming my life completely. I made a cold decision. Clear. Legal. Not impulsive. Not dramatic. Simply necessary. With the help of Rebecca's lawyer friend, I drafted a formal separation agreement. It wasn't divorce. Not yet. But it was a perfectly drawn line in the sand. A real boundary. One that could no longer be ignored, minimized, or dismissed as overthinking. Because after months of being displaced, silenced, and turned into the invisible administrator of a home that was also mine, I needed more than empty conversations. I needed protection. I needed structure. I needed consequences. Rebecca handled scanning all the documents and sending them to both Nolan's personal email and his work account. I wanted to ensure one very simple thing. That he couldn't pretend he didn't see it. That he couldn't lose it among unread messages. That he couldn't escape reality this time. And the reality was this. The house, legally, was far more protected on my side than he had ever realized. I had contributed the majority of the initial down payment. Yes, the mortgage was in both our names. But the land title was solely in my name. I remember perfectly when Nolan insisted it wasn't necessary to include me in everything. "It's all ours, Liv. It doesn't matter." At the time it sounded romantic. turned out to be strategically perfect. Because that legal detail, the one he had minimized, became my greatest advantage. The separation agreement clearly outlined conditions regarding property, residence, and occupancy rights in the event of separation. Exactly for a situation like this. When Nolan received the document, he called me the very next morning in absolute panic. "Olivia, what is this?" His voice no longer sounded confident. It sounded scared. And for the first time, he understood this was serious. "It's a boundary in writing," I replied calmly. "Are you seriously doing all this over a couple of weekends?" I closed my eyes for a second. He still wanted to reduce months of invasion to a couple of weekends. He still wanted to minimize it. "It was never just a couple of weekends," I replied slowly. "And you know that." Silence. Long. Heavy. Finally, in a much quieter voice, he said, "I can't afford this house on my own." "I know." There was no cruelty in my answer. Only truth. I heard him release a shaky breath. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No," I answered. "I'm simply saying that if they stay, I won't." It was simple. His choices had consequences. For the first time, I wasn't asking permission. I was setting terms. Over the next 2 weeks, Nolan tried to resist. He tried to adapt. He tried to prove he could make it work. But reality hit quickly. He asked Sandra to cook. She refused. "I don't want to interfere with Olivia's system." Course. The same woman who had invaded every corner of my home now suddenly pretended to respect boundaries when real work was involved. He asked Glenn to help fix the broken dishwasher. Glenn ignored him. Sandra also refused to do laundry, claiming she didn't want to touch Olivia's things. Glenn filled the sink with takeout containers and left them there. As always, no responsibility, no effort, no intention of contributing. Little by little, Nolan began to unravel. First, he survived on fast food, then frozen microwave dinners. His pride began collapsing right alongside the organization of the house. And eventually, he stopped responding to my messages, not because he no longer cared, but because he knew every message from me represented a truth he could no longer avoid. Then came the final breaking point. He overdrew our shared bank account. I saw the transaction, and I acted immediately. I froze the card. No drama, no warning, just action. He called me almost instantly, furious. "You froze the account." His anger was obvious. I answered with complete calm. "You no longer have automatic access to funds I'm not using. We're separated." Furious silence. "I moved my direct deposit," I added. "You should do the same." I heard him curse under his breath. And then he finally said the inevitable. "Maybe we should just sell the house." There it was. The final card. The desperate solution. "That depends on you," I replied. "But if you choose to sell, I have first right of purchase." Another pause. "It's in the agreement." I could practically feel his frustration through the phone. "So what? You want the house back now?" "No," I replied with absolute composure. "I simply want the option." Then I added with surgical precision, "After all, you already filled it with the residence you chose." And then, he hung up, because there was no argument against the truth. Only silence. Only consequences. Only the real weight of decisions he had assumed for far too long that I would continue tolerating. But not anymore, because I had finally stopped being the woman who asked for space. Now I was the woman reclaiming it. 1 week later, I received the notification that, deep down, I knew would come eventually. The house was officially for sale. While staying with Rebecca, I had set alerts on multiple real estate websites for any movement connected to our address. Not because I wanted to hold on, but because I needed to be prepared. When I saw the listing, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Curiosity, sadness, relief. Clicked the link. And honestly, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The photos were almost unrecognizable. My former living room, The one I had once decorated with obsessive care, scented candles, perfectly chosen pillows, and visual harmony, now looked like a chaotic garage sale. Mismatched old chairs, magazines piled everywhere, Glenn's foot massager sitting in the middle of the room like a centerpiece. My kitchen, once pristine, bright, and elegant, now had sticky notes plastered on drawers and cabinets with messages like, "Do not touch," Sandra's utensils, Glenn's use. It was absolute madness. In one photo, there was even laundry piled on the guest bed. My old yoga room, my sanctuary, officially transformed into domestic chaos. I stared at the images, feeling both devastated and completely amused. Rebecca leaned over my shoulder, looked at the photos and said, "It looks like a Craigslist bachelor pad, with parental supervision." I couldn't help but laugh, 'cause she was right. And to think, I used to light candles in that bathroom. I once believed that house represented stability, success, and peace. In the end, Nolan sold it below market value. The real estate listing read, "Highly motivated seller. Flexible timing. Minor repairs needed." Minor repairs. What an elegant way to say. This place was emotionally demolished. The sale closed in less than a month. A neighborhood record. No, I didn't buy the house back, because by then I had learned something essential. I didn't need to reclaim that place to reclaim my life. I had already found something better. My new home was a small rental townhouse. Nothing flashy, nothing excessive, but it was mine. Had a balcony, a deep soaking tub, silence, and most importantly, no one entered without an invitation. That's where I rebuilt my peace. I worked. I slept deeply. I visited my parents when I wanted. I hosted brunches with real friends. I laughed, breathed, I lived. And for the first time in a very long time, I was only folding my own laundry. 6 months after leaving that house, I ran into a mutual friend at a coffee shop. First, she barely recognized me. She looked at me surprised and said, "You look different, more radiant." Smiled. Because it wasn't makeup. It wasn't makeup. It wasn't clothes. It was peace. I casually asked, "How's Nolan?" He shrugged. "Living with his parents for now. And apparently it's pretty overwhelming." I nodded slowly. It always was. 'Cause yes, the burden never changed. The only thing that changed was who finally had to carry it. Later, while helping Rebecca pack for her own move, we toasted together to new beginnings. She raised her glass and asked me, "Do you regret anything?" I thought about it for a moment, and answered with complete honesty, "Yes, not leaving sooner." Rebecca smiled. "Want me to help you with the divorce?" I let out a small laugh. "It's already done." The papers had been signed the previous week and officially filed. Last, it was truly over. We clinked our glasses. The house was gone. The marriage too. But more importantly, the weight had disappeared. Because I hadn't just left a property. I had escaped a destructive pattern. I had broken a dynamic where my peace was always negotiable. Months later, Sandra left me a voicemail. She wanted to meet for coffee. To talk. I deleted it without listening to the rest. Because some conversations come far too late. And some doors once closed deserve to stay that way. I learned that peace often looks like absence. Sometimes it sounds like silence. And other times, it feels like waking up alone in your own home, taking a deep breath, and realizing that, finally, you are free. Months later, my life looked nothing like the exhausted, invisible, broken woman who once stood frozen in front of 2 suitcases blocking her doorway. I had changed. Not just on the outside, but from the deepest parts of myself. My new home wasn't huge. It didn't have soaring ceilings or luxury finishes. But every corner belonged entirely to me. The balcony became my favorite place to drink coffee in the mornings, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunrise without interruptions, without criticism, without blaring television. The deep soaking tub became my private evening sanctuary, where I could sink into silence and remember something I had forgotten for years. Peace is priceless. I returned to yoga. Not in an invaded room. Not between someone else's boxes. Not sacrificing my dreams to accommodate others. I practiced in my living room, windows open, candles lit, in complete serenity. I reclaimed my body, my mind, my routine, my identity. At work I thrived like never before. Concentrating no longer felt like a daily battle. My projects improved. My clients noticed. I received a major promotion less than a year later. For the first time, my energy wasn't being drained by merely surviving at home. I could invest it into building the future I truly deserved. My parents visited occasionally. They always called first. They always asked. They always respected my space. And every time they left, my home still felt like mine. That, more than any luxurious house, was true wealth. Nolan tried contacting me several times during the final stages of the divorce. First there were apologies, then nostalgia, then promises to change. He even claimed he had started therapy, that he understood his mistakes, that he now saw how deeply he had failed me. And maybe it was true. Maybe he really did learn. But some lessons arrive only after the damage is already done. After love has been replaced by clarity. After a woman stops asking how to save something, and starts asking why she ever accepted so little. I wished him well, honestly, but I never went back. Because healing doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes healing means never returning to the place that broke you. Sandra, of course, kept trying. Messages, calls, even a handwritten letter about family, misunderstandings, and second chances. I never responded. Not out of hatred, not out of resentment, but because I finally understood something powerful. Not everyone deserves access to your new piece just because they knew the old version of you. Glenn eventually moved back with Sandra to a smaller home in another state, after living full-time with Nolan proved too stressful. The irony never stopped being delicious. Rebecca remained my rock, the sister I chose. The woman who reminded me that strategy, dignity, and courage could coexist. We used to joke that the moving truck had been more effective than years of therapy. And honestly, maybe it was. Over time I stopped telling my story with pain. I began telling it with pride. Because it was no longer a story about an invasive mother-in-law or an indifferent husband. It became a story about reclamation. About boundaries. About a woman who stopped shrinking herself to make room for others. A woman who learned that home is not always the place where you live, but the place where you can fully exist without apology. 2 years later, during a dinner with friends, someone asked me, "If you could go back, would you change anything?" Smiled. I thought about that old house. The suitcases. The sticky notes. The lost yoga room. The message that changed everything. And I answered, I wouldn't change what happened. I just would have chosen to love myself sooner. Because that was the real victory. Not the separation. Not the sale. Not the divorce. The true victory was remembering my own worth. Understanding that being kind does not mean being expendable. That loving someone does not mean disappearing. That marriage does not mean tolerating invasion. And that peace is always worth the hardest decision. Today, when I close my door at night, I hear silence. Not unfamiliar footsteps. Not demands. Not passive-aggressive commentary. Just silence. And every single time, smile. Because that silence is not empty. It is filled with freedom. Filled with dignity. Filled with the life I reclaimed. My name is Olivia. And this was never the story of how I lost my house. It was the story of how I got my life back.